Last time we were talking about 5 ways. And one of the arguments we talked about was the cosmological argument. It appears in 2 forms of Aquinas. One talks about motion, which we discussed last time, and the other talking about efficient causation. But it's really the same argument in a sense. You've got some event, let's just call it E, and that's preceded by some other event, let's just call it E1, that by E2 and so on. These are related causally somehow. And then the idea is, well, that couldn't go back to infinity. It must go to some limit. So there must have been a first cause. We'll just say E first. There's got to be a first event. A first event, and then there has to be some cause. Gosh. It looks as if the only thing that could be a cause of the very first event would be something that's not itself an event, namely God. So God in this view is the prime mover, the first cause, not an event, of course, but if you think of events as going back in time, there would be a beginning, and then God is that which sets the whole thing in motion. So that's the basic picture. God here exerts causal power. God's creator, God's the first cause. Now, we talked a little bit about the problems in this argument. It's something that is sometimes referred to as the Kalam argument, because it was developed by, well, initially Aristotle, but then various thinkers, especially early in the Islamic tradition. Al-Farabi was a version of this argument, for example. In basically the 10th and 11th centuries, this appears in Islamic writings. It's later given a more refined version by Barrows. Maimonides advances a version of this argument. So it's something that is common with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But now, if you start thinking about the arguments, you can quickly start thinking, wait, there are issues, there are problems with this. One of them we identified last time. We begin thinking about problems. We can say, well, okay, first of all, yeah, this is God as creator. How do we get from first cause, let's say, to any other property of God, to perfection, for example? Or for that matter, any component of omniscience, to omnibenevolence, and so on. And so it looks as if it's puzzling why this creator, why this first cause would have to have any of the properties we traditionally associate with God. And it's not very reassuring that Aquinas just says, well, and this everyone calls God. That's not an argument. And so how does one think of it? Are there other problems that you can identify here? Yeah.
The most commonly asked question is, well, then what caused God?
Well, you can ask what caused God. And so if you say that, we have to say, well, yeah, God is in some sense self-caused, right? And so the traditional way of answering that is to say God is a se, which is Latin for sort of through himself. God exists through himself. So sometimes this is translated as God is self-subsistent or self-caused. But of course, that's slightly funny because we don't ordinarily think of anything causing itself. And indeed, Aquinas uses the premise that nothing can cause itself, nothing can set itself in motion, and so on. And so we've got to rest content with the idea that somehow your God is the whole story, the end of the story, in a way that nothing else is. And so if you just say, well, what caused God? The answer is pretty clear. Well, no, it's supposed to be like this, okay? But in a certain sense, you can say, well, wait, how can that be possible for God and not possible for anything else? And so it's, in a certain sense, easy to answer your question. In another sense, it feels arbitrary, right? Or puzzling. How could anything be, in any sense, self-caused or self-subsistent or whatever this notion is exactly supposed to be? Any other objections? Yeah?
This one might be kind of funny, but does there really have to be a first cause?
Oh, good. Okay, this is one of the complaints of Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, in the Islamic tradition, is a philosopher who is very pithy, very easy to read, fun to read. Something of skeptic, sort of like an Islamic human, if you can imagine such a thing. But anyway, Al-Ghazali advances a number of arguments in a work he entitles The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And so what he does in particular, in this very pithy work, actually quite short. It is fun to read. But in the Incoherence of the Philosophers, he says, wait a minute, how is it possible, or why is it impossible, I should say, for there to be an infinite series of causes? And so, in other words, why does there have to be a first cause? Why couldn't the chain of events go back to infinity? Why couldn't time be infinite? Why couldn't the universe be infinite? And in fact, he gives, part of the reason I mentioned Hume, is that he actually gives an argument. He says, look, any argument for this position would basically have to be a priori or a posteriori. Is there anything in experience that indicates that the universe, that time, etc., don't go back infinitely far? Now, Aquinas has a sort of thought, which is, wait, if it went back infinitely, how do we ever get here? How do we ever get to any point? And if you indeed think, yeah, wait, but there's a sense in which that's in question begging, as always says. Look, that assumes there's some starting point, right? And if the starting point were infinitely far away, but if it really reaches back infinitely in both directions, let's say back in time and also forward in time, then there is no, like, how did we get here? That's like saying, what do you mean there are negative numbers? Like, then how did we ever get to zero? So from his point of view, no, that's not a contradiction in concept. I'm sorry, there's nothing in experience really contradicted. And is there any contradiction in concept? Well, as the negative numbers show, no, you can imagine that we're at a certain point and time extends infinitely in both directions. So he says, really, there's no a priori argument, there's no a posteriori argument, I think it's experience, so there's no argument at all.
Yeah. To give you another issue, and how do you know that U2 actually causes E1 or E1 actually causes? I guess the objection would be ignoring the cause itself.
Okay, yes, all this assumes that there's a kind of causal structure in the world, but what if that's not true? What if there is real randomness?
Yeah. And so I think that can be modified by Avicenna's argument where he uses contingent beings versus necessary beings.
Ah, good, okay, yes. So Avicenna gives a version of the argument where he talks about contingency and necessity. And he basically says, let's don't think about causation simply, let's think about dependence and independence, contingency and necessity. Then his argument is really there has to be a necessary being, right? And now how does that go? Actually.
Yeah, so if you would just observe himself, you would say like, I can be 100% sure that I'm not self-sufficient. So I have, for my existence is dependent on something else. So I'm not a dependent being. So, and then you kind of go through this kind of causal, but this ontological causality. And so you finally get to a being that cannot be dependent on anything else.
Right, good.
And then he assumes that there are multiple beings that are independent, then that would lead to a contradiction, so therefore there can only be one. But yeah, that's kind of...
Right, nice, okay. Yeah, Avicenna, so you can see now, gives the following sort of argument. He says, don't think in terms of causation, think in terms of necessity and contingency. The basic thought here is that God is the necessary being. And so one way of looking at his argument is to say, it takes this and flips it vertically.
Yeah, just another observation, it kind of reminds me of like in an axiomatic system, how certain statements are kind of like caused by previous statements until eventually get to a set of axioms.
Yes!
And that's kind of how I see it.
Exactly right. So here we have some sort of dependent being. And then it depends on something, right? But now the question is, could that chain of dependencies go on forever? Could your being, for example, depend on the being of something else, and that depend on something else, and that depend on something else, and so on, all the way down? Well, the thought here is, no. Eventually, there must be something that serves as a foundation for all of this, that is some sort of necessary being. Now, is it possible that lots of things depend on different beings? Well, possible. But then it gives you an argument that if it's really an ultimate necessity, if it's really something that's completely independent, then in fact there's one such being. So you might think, yeah, look, there are lots of dependencies like this where things depend on other things and so forth. They depend on still others and blah, blah, blah. But eventually you get down to one thing. There's a unity, the ultimately necessary being, and that's God. So it's very much like this picture, but just turned 90 degrees. Yeah.
What stops everything from being codependent? So why can't you just have a complex web of dependencies? Why does it have to all filter down to one?
Good.
And you would just like, if A depends on B and B depends on C and C depends on A, and then came first, so Where is the origin of the dependency?
But that supposes that there's
Especially
an
when you
origin.
consider
That's-
time.
Oh, sorry, Rachel.
I was just saying, especially when you consider time and how time flows and like.
But we're talking about cosmological, contingency.
Right, but it's like, how do you have a chain of dependency? Because like what you're talking about is basically it's gonna end up being a circle. It's gonna come back around. It doesn't seem that like
Think about an axiomatic system. You can't have all the derivations depending on each other. They have to be founded on certain axioms, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
those are supposed to be like the self-evident truth. That's why I'm saying this. So it's like outside of time. It's not a dependency of time. I mean, at least that's what I think he conceived.
Yeah, I mean, you can say, just as in epistemology, you can say, wait a minute, maybe there's no foundation, maybe there's really just a web, and you have this coherence picture. Knowledge all fits together. But there is this objection then, well, wait a minute. If A depends on B, and B depends on C, and C depends on A again, then how does that all work, right? You might think there must be something that whole system depends on then. It's not impossible, maybe. You might say various people in an economy are like this. You depend on certain other people, they depend on you ultimately. There's this big interdependent web. What does all of that depend on? Well, this objection goes, maybe nothing, maybe that's all there is. But the response would be, no, there must be something that whole web depends upon for its existence. How does it get there? Yeah.
It seems like that argument seems like it runs into the same problem that Aquinas' argument runs into, and that's even if there is like a necessary even if there's like one necessary being, that doesn't imply that it has like agency. I think.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So how do we get from necessity to the other properties of God? To perfection, for example. And we do seem to encounter the same. Now, if we define God as a necessary being, that's what it does. So it's like, okay, right? That's God, but wait, the necessary being? Why is the necessary being something that is all good, for example? Why does it have any agency at all? Why can it be considered to have a personality? Why is this necessary? I mean, for example, in Aristotelian, you look at this and say, the necessary being, that must be just matter, right? And so there are ways of saying, yeah, I grant that things depend on something, but why should that be a perfect being? Why should that have any of the properties of God? Now, actually, Al-Ghazali considers this possibility too, and thinks, in a sense, he can apply his argument as well. Why does there have to be a necessary being? The arguments here get very complex, but he basically says, why can't it be contingent all the way down? Do we really have to assume that there is anything that is necessary? You've maybe heard of this image. Actually, it really does have a foundation in Indian philosophy, but my favorite version comes from John Locke, who's, when he's talking about substance, actually says it's a lot like the story of the following Indian philosopher. The Indian philosopher is asked, well, what is it that the earth depends on? And he says the earth rests on the back of a great elephant. And then someone says, well, what's the elephant? The elephant rests on the back of a great turtle. They say, what does the turtle rest on? And Locke says his answer is something I know not what. Now, in the popular funny version of the story, the person says, you can't get me with this, it's turtles all the way down. And in a way, Al-Ghazali's complaint is, why is it just turtles all the way down? Okay, this is sort of like the web argument. The web has interdependencies. This is just like, well, why can't there be this infinite regress? The idea is, wait, that would be an infinite regress and that's bad. Al-Ghazali says, why is it bad exactly? I don't get it. Maybe I depend on something and it depends on something else, and it's turtles all the way down, it just keeps going. Whoever says there's anything that stops that. And so why not think it's infinite descending in like the way we might think this could be infinite off to the left? Now there is an attempt to combine this. In Western philosophy it really waits until Leibniz, but in Islamic thought it comes with Averroes, whose Islamic name is Ibn Rashid. And the argument goes like this. Start with this picture that we had before, the horizontal picture. Maybe it goes back to a first cause, maybe it goes on infinitely. He says that's not the interesting question. So take that entire system. And in Aquinas, actually, it's possible to read his argument about causation in this way. At certain points, he says, now think about what causes omnia, everything. And if we take that in this sort of collective sense, we could say, all right, what's all behind all of that? Okay? Take the universe. Don't worry about whether it's finite or infinite, whether there's a first cause, a big bang or not. Doesn't matter. Just think, why the universe? Okay, what explains it? And now we can think of it depending on something. And so it's a kind of relation of dependence. And now we're going to put it in the vertical thing. There must be something that explains all of this. Now, maybe there is. Maybe there is. It depends on a certain kind of system of physical laws. So a D1, let's say, for this thing that it depends on. And maybe that depends on something else, and so on. Could that go all the way down? His argument is no. Okay? He says there are two senses of causation at work in all of these things. One, which I've been referring to as the horizontal sense, the efficient causation sense. This other, dependent sense. And he says, really, to straighten out the argument, you've got to distinguish those two. Here, there's a legitimate point about infinity. Al-Ghazali is right. Maybe that goes back infinitely. But here, he says, it really can't. It gets down to something fundamental, which is God. Now, it can look like that's exactly just a version of Avicenna's argument, and in a way it is. But his point is really this. I think, what explains the existence of the universe? What explains us being here? Well, we can talk in terms of this system of efficient causes. But if we say, well, what explains all of this? What about the whole world? Give me an account of that. He says, well, on one level, you could say that's a scientific question. What is it that explains the existence of the universe? The way everything works? Maybe you can come up with some law-like explanation of that. But you can always raise the same question. Why those laws? Why those initial conditions for the universe? And maybe you could try to give some scientific explanation of that even. But once you come up with the explanation, it's in terms of something, and then what explains that? So it's like your question of finding the axioms. It's really sort of, look, think about a physical theory of the universe that tries to explain everything at this level. At some point you say, well, what's doing the explaining? It's something here, but then what explains that? Suppose you have this Newtonian picture of the universe, and you say, oh, I can express it in terms of certain fundamental physical laws, but then you can say, well, what explains the law? Why those laws? Why are those the ones that govern the universe? And it's a question that Newton actually took seriously. It's something not well known, but he did a lot of work on biblical scholarship, actually trying to answer that question in religious terms. And he thought that question made good sense, and that ultimately it led you out of the universe as such. Because whatever you say in purely naturalistic terms, you can always say, well, why is that the system of nature? And in the end, you've got to go outside of it. And so, in a way, Averroes' point is, the cosmological argument is something that really says the universe, however you characterize it, in terms of the chain of efficient causes, or even in terms of the laws and the systems that support it, so on, all of that, you can keep asking why. And you can't get an answer within the system. It's something that pushes you outside the system. All right. Now, one can agree or disagree, but in a sense, what Averroes is trying to do is get you to the foundation of this. Now, Aquinas was familiar with Averroes' thought. Averroes died in 1198. Aquinas is writing in the 13th century. There were Latin Averroes, and a lot of Averroes' works were translated into Latin. And so, actually, once you've seen this, you can, to some extent, read Aquinas' arguments in a different way. The Summa is written as a textbook. It's really like, this is what he would say to his students. So presumably, actually, his own thoughts on this were much more complex. And I think what we have, once you see this picture, you can say, oh, maybe omnia doesn't mean each individual thing has some cause. Maybe it really means, oh, everything must have some explanation. And so this may well be the picture he had in mind. In any case, as I said, a couple of the arguments that he gives are expressions of this cosmological argument. But that's not his only argument. And so, notice, however, what is the account, what is God, really, if this is our path to God through the cosmological argument? What is God's most basic property, or at least the one that's revealed through all of this? Yeah?
I think separate from his creation, but I have a question going back to Al-Ghazali.
Right.
Since we're assuming that he's, I guess, separate from his creation, could a pantheistic sort of model get out of the first cause argument by saying all that there is has always been eternal, and we just kind of like participate in the
Okay.
like all like God is his creation kind of thing. So Contingency is just like a minute out of being.
Right. Yeah, maybe it's worth mentioning two variants. One is pantheism. And pantheism is basically the view that God equals nature. So, from this point of view, this doesn't push you outside, as you say, the system of nature. It's just that God gets identified with the whole system. There's a sense in which, from this point of view, that doesn't explain anything. If I say, well, why? Why nature? No, why is there something rather than nothing? And why is it like this rather than something else? To say, well, God just is that system, doesn't give me an answer. It just sort of says, hey, it is what it is. And actually, there have been relatively few pantheists. But there have been many people who are sometimes called panentheists. Panentheism is the idea that God includes nature. And so that would lead us to draw this in a different way. The pantheists would say, well, here's a contrived one draw. Well, actually, that makes God part of nature. I can't draw it that way. How am I drawing?
God is a big circle and nature is just one little circle inside that.
Yeah, I guess I have to draw it like this so that God's supposed to be in the center. And basically, God is everything inside the circle and nature is just part of God. It's not clear. I mean, certainly that does change my account, saying this argument is all about saying nature isn't self-sufficient. Nature points you outside to something that could be an explanation. From this point of view, well, sort of, yes, but that thing to which it points you should be understood as incorporating all of that, including. In any case, I'm not sure really what to say about those variants, but it does lead to a somewhat different picture of God's relationship to nature. Now, there's another argument in Aquinas that I'll talk about a little briefly. It's sometimes called the teleological argument, or the argument from design. And as he puts it, it goes like this. Natural bodies act toward an end. Okay? So if this has been an argument basically on the grounds of efficient causation, something like that, the teleological argument is based on final causation. And so the thought is basically, everything tends toward an end. And secondly, things adhere to their ends by design, but natural bodies, these things that act toward an end, I said everything, but instead of acting natural bodies, things are directed to ends. By design, by intelligent beings. Oh, sorry, I already put my design there. And so the idea is that, well, things are directed at some kind of goal, some kind of end. It's not an accident that this is the case. Things tend to be directed toward an end when they are designed, but when they're designed by intelligent beings. And so this conclusion is something intelligent designed everything. And what is that something intelligent? God. Now this argument has been put in much better ways in later philosophy. That's why I said I'll do this quickly. Because this is a terrible argument in form, you can see. And yet, there is underlying it an argument of real power. It's just that this isn't it. Okay? But I want to sort of isolate the decent thought that lies behind this terrible expression. So, what's wrong with that argument? What are some objections? Yeah.
One.
What do you want?
Not everything has to go toward an end.
Ah, yes, okay. Right. So, yeah. In fact, I'll do A. One is false. Not everything goes toward an end. Okay? For example.
Careless actions that we make.
Good. Has anybody ever said, why did you do that? And the answer is, I don't know. Didn't mean to do that. Okay, it was a mistake. Now sometimes, you didn't mean to do that, but sometimes it's just accidental. You're walking in the kitchen, your arm bumps something that's on the counter, knocks it off, smashes it on the floor. Somebody says, why did you break that glass? I didn't mean to. But if you ever say, well, everything's in sort of an end, it's like, hey, no, I know, I've read Aquinas. Everything was directed at some goal by an intelligent being. You mentioned yeah.
But by the very fact that you're saying it's a mistake or an accident, doesn't that imply that it's supposed to happen and that your actions are really supposed to, head towards the you're not supposed to go around just, randomly knocking faces over and...
Okay, good. Now she says, look, the fact that you're mistaken and you're being blamed for it and so on, you're trying to get out of it, indicates, look, your actions are supposed to be directed to an end, and somehow you violated this, and but the whole point is that wasn't it. So it's one thing to say things are supposed to be directed toward an end. You're supposed to direct your actions toward happiness or the glorification of God or whatever it is. That's one thing. But this doesn't say everything should tend toward an end. It says everything really does. And so in that sense, to say, yeah, look, your actions didn't tend toward an end, so you screwed up. That's a way of saying that's not true, because sometimes things go wrong. Of course, there can also be things that seem random, right? A particle decays. You're an atomic physicist studying radioactive particles. This particle decays at a certain time. Why did it do it right then? Well, maybe there's just no explanation for that. Maybe that wasn't directed at an end. Now, maybe, of course, there's no efficient cause, but maybe also it's like, what was the purpose of doing it? If you think, yeah, why did they set up so that it did that right then? Maybe that was really kind of random. Is it true that things adhere to their ends by design? Yeah.
By design, you mean something that, we can organize, typical, design of a computer environment or a building or something that we make? That type of design?
Don't ask me what I mean. Ask what Aquinas means, and I don't know. Okay? But you're right to say that's a big question. What do you mean by design? For example, actually this happens in my house all the time. I put something in the refrigerator or on the counter. It gets mold. Okay? Now, did that happen by design? Well, certainly not my design, right? I didn't mean for it to get moldy. It's not like I thought, well, I'm going to experiment. What happens if you just leave a loaf of bread on the table for 3 months? No, it wasn't my design. Well, if it wasn't my design, then whose design was it? Was it the mold's design? Was the mold thinking, bread? It's like, wait. So anyway, I think it's a good question. Certain things certainly adhere to their ends by design. You might say, yeah, why are there such big windows in this classroom? Well, somebody designed them, right? There were intelligent beings behind it. They created the design because they thought, probably, philosophy's kind of depressing, it's gloomy, so put big windows in here to light the room up. I don't know what they thought, but I like that aspect of this. So you could say, yeah, well, some things like that seem done by design, but other things, even things that are directed toward an end. For example, everything is directed toward, well, at least in the near vicinity of the Earth, is directed toward an end in the sense that, look at that, things fall. Now, Aristotle thought this is a sign that things have a natural home, and they want to get home. This is a lens cap. Is its natural home on the camera? No, it's somewhere down there. See where it wants to go? No, the table won't let it. It's really trying. It tries again. Okay, now we're tempted to say, no, look, it's not that it has some natural home, it's designed to go there or something. There's just this gravitational force, and so it's not seeking an end by design, it's something else happening. So in short, we could say, look, it's puzzling what design really is supposed to mean here, but it looks like a plausible understanding that the two is just false. Not everything really does adhere to an end, even when it has an end by design. 3, things are directed to ends by intelligent beings. So is that always true? Yeah.
I think it had the same problem as 1. Like you could do something for like no reason.
The mold really is one of the most intelligent beings of the cockroach on the face of the earth.
That's true. Mold is everywhere, right? Cockroaches are everywhere, and they're very resilient. So you might say, yeah, how does that happen? They must be brilliant. Brilliant mold, brilliant cockroaches. Or, you know, all right, we're being silly here, but you might say, well, there are lots of counterexamples. One would think. So premise 3. Often things do seem to tend toward an end, like cockroaches do tend to survive and thrive and reproduce, but is it because they're intelligent beings? If you think about it, they are animals, maybe they've got some degree of intelligence. What about plants that do it? Kudzu spreads, but is it an intelligent being? Mold spreads, and so on. Now, consider the last one. Something intelligent designed everything. Yeah.
The same problem you have with Aquinas in the beginning. It's fine. In fact, if you accept number 4 before you accept the rest, then you can say, well, the cockroach was designed by God, the cockroach was designed to survive, the mold was designed to, but it's circular. It implies God in its very position.
Okay. Let me put the same, I think it's the same point, but somewhat differently. Yeah.
I feel that it suffers the same problem that all teleological arguments suffer, and that's that it's like disanalogous. There's not really, it's not really a good analogy.
Ooh, okay. Actually, yes. Let's put that in a separate point. There may be, look, just a disanalogy here. I mean, we're talking about the direction of things toward a goal, but already you can get things being designed. You can get the sense we're being fast and loose with that concept. Buildings are designed, but is mold designed? I mean, maybe, but then only if we're presupposing the conclusion. And so it's sort of like, wait, I don't know how to do this in a way that's not sort of question-begging and keeping design and intelligence and so on meaning the same thing all the way through the argument. Yeah.
You only get certain like characteristics of being. You don't necessarily get like the kind of God that he's going for.
Good. Okay, right. Actually, let me put your thought down before I forget completely. There is a sense in which this seems question-begging, but also then, yes, the other properties of God. So, how do we get from design to perfection? This is an argument that Hume uses in the dialogues concerning natural religion, and he does it in a very fine way. He says, look, the most famous version of this argument really is in William Payne, who says, you're walking on the beach, and you find a watch, okay? Now, if you think, William Payne, you're walking on the beach, you find a watch, you pick it up, and would anybody say, look at this, I mean, all these miles of sand, but all of a sudden, the particles of nature have just like come together and magically and form this thing. No, you'd say, this somebody designed, somebody made this, okay? So when there is something that has an intricate kind of complexity, where the parts interact and so on, you don't say that feels unnatural. If there's just a sand dune, you might say, the wind just did that. But the watch on the beach, nobody's going to say, oh, the wind did that. That was a product of design. And then he says there's an analogy between the watch and the universe. They're both highly complex systems of things that work together in complex interrelated ways. That's not something that could have happened by chance. That required design. Now that's a much better version of the arguments, I think. But still, you've got this problem of how you get to perfection. Suppose there was a designer. Hume says, well, look at the universe. Suppose it was designed. First of all, he says, why think it was designed by one being? After all, if things are directed at a bunch of different ends, and they're directed by intelligent beings, Who says they're all directed by the same being, right? Different beings might direct different ends. Hume says, what if the world was designed by a committee? Okay? Or what if it's really the result of not a perfect activity of a perfect being, but it's sort of some progression in a series of botched universes. Like, yeah, some being created this first universe, horrible universe. So next universe, that's not so good. This one, it's a little better. This is ours. It's all, this being is getting better and better at making universes. Well, that doesn't imply a perfect being. And so I think even if you've got this design picture, it's a perfect being. Yeah.
I think we dismissed number one too quickly because just in our natural experience in the world, we create things, we like build houses and make the things for a specific purpose. And so I think things do tend toward an end that we assign to it. And just thinking about like our bodies, they have to have or they have nutritional needs that have to be met, or else they don't function properly. I think this is true of like the human spirit, or just like our emotional health needs, a certain degree of like affirmation, appreciation, and community. And so I think I don't think that everything just exists randomly. I think that like Aristotle's is right when it says there's right cause involved.
Right.
I think so.
Okay, good. She's trying to defend the argument, and it suggests the following thought. I said, look, there's, I think, a good idea here, even though Aquinas is expressing it maybe as badly as anybody ever expressed it. By the way, if you want to see a horrible version of the cosmological argument, look at Locke. Near the end of the essay concerning, the essay concerning human understanding, he gives you a version of the cosmological argument. But by then, he doesn't have, he's an empiricist. He doesn't have any of the premises he can really rest on. So he just makes crap up. And it's really bad. It's really a bad version. But it doesn't mean the cosmological argument is terrible. It just means Locke gives you a really bad version, right? It's sort of like, look, I've read a lot of student papers, and I've seen a lot of terrible versions of good philosophical arguments. So then you get a terrible version doesn't mean the argument itself is bad. It may just mean that person has expressed it very poorly. So let's go back to this Averroes version of the cosmological argument and see if we can adapt it to the teleological argument. We could say, well, look, lots of things in nature are directed at things, right? They have final causes as well as efficient causes. So lots of things do seem to happen for purposes. And indeed, it seems like human beings in particular are suited for certain purposes. It's not just that we design things to serve our purposes, but perhaps we have purposes. And as you point out, there are things about us, needs. We have things that point beyond ourselves to the community, to perhaps God, to whatever. If that's true, then you might say, all right, all of this then, the whole system of nature, but including us, okay, all of that direction now is something that itself seems directed at something. And so now we don't think of this as something it depends on in the sense of being some sort of system of laws or something of that sort, but we think of it in terms of something the universe is directed at. And we think, well, what would be the purpose of all of this? Don't think about what's the purpose of the lens cap or the mold or the cockroach. Think, not even what's my purpose, what's the purpose of the whole thing? Go back to that question, why is there something rather than nothing? But now ask it in this final causation sense. What's the point of the universe? Why is any of this here? And the thought is, well, it must be directed at something. Okay, there must be some purpose. Now, in all of these cases, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, I think it's always possible to say, no, it's just nothing outside. In other words, if you keep asking why, eventually you just run out of answers. It's like, they're kids when they're about 2 go through this stage. What color is the sky? Why? And then you try to give some scientific explanation. You half remember it, probably screw it up. Oh, there are different wavelengths of light, blah, 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 blah. Well, why? Why does light come in different wavelengths? It's like, well, I don't know. and then maybe you try to impress them with some law. You say, well, it has some present law, or whatever, I don't remember. And, well, why are those laws? I mean, why is the universe constructed so that this is the case? What's the point of having a blue sky? And at some point you might just say, well, shut up. Or, good question, someday you'll go to college and you'll study physics and then you can ask your professor or something. I mean, and maybe at the end you just have to say, look, there's no answer. But the philosopher here, I think, requires this thing, is the person who keeps asking why. And ultimately, he's thinking, there's got to be some explanation. There's got to be some causal or dependence type explanation, that's the cosmological argument. There's got to be some purposive explanation, that's the teleological argument. So it's another argument, really, that there's something about the whole system of nature that points outside itself. And so, from that point of view, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument have exactly the same structure. They're saying there's something ultimately unintelligible about the universe as it stands, unless you assume that it is resting on, depending on, something that is itself self-sufficient, namely God, or is serving some kind of purpose related to a self-sufficient being, namely God. Yeah?
I was going to ask, are there any good counter-arguments to there being absolute truth? Because it doesn't necessarily lead to there being a God or anything, but having an argument between saying there is truth and there's not truth, both are still truths. So I don't know if we can draw a parallel between that and purpose.
Right.
Are there any good counter-arguments to that? Because I've never heard one. I'm curious.
Well, last time we talked a little bit about Aquinas' reaction to that argument from truth that you can find in Augustine. And he doesn't like that version, and yet he does give another version among his 5 ways. And I've got to admit, I've never quite known what to do with it. And I've never seen much discussion. So if you say, are there great responses? The answer is, there actually haven't been many responses, oddly enough. But yeah, the truth argument, if you remember, was really, how did it go? There is truth. Suppose, the argument is suppose not. Good, right? Then, yeah, there is no truth. So, it's true that there is no truth. Contradiction. Yeah. And then, but God is truth. Right? So, there is God. And Aquinas' response to that version is to say, well, wait a minute. Actually, it's puzzling because he says, well, that doesn't establish that there's a first truth. I think he's worried that what I get is at least one truth here. Like the truth, that there is no truth, right? Well, okay, that's wrong. So, there is truth. And it is true, there is truth, and so on. But those look like a lot of different truths. They must have something in common, namely truth. If we adopt a kind of Platonic form of argument. But first thing is, it is kind of a Platonic argument. And Aquinas is not a Platonist. So the Platonist can say, yes, there's this truth. It is true that there is truth. It is true that I am speaking. It is true that today is Monday, and so on and so forth. But those are truths. By virtue of what can we say there is such a thing as truth in the abstract? Separate from all those individual truths. A Platonist will say, oh, I know how to do that, right? There must be something by virtue of which all of these truths are called truth, and it must involve some relation to a thing, a form of truth. But Aquinas isn't good with any of that. I mean, he's an Aristotelian. He says, look, forms exist only in things. And so there are just the individual truths. He can't make that move. So basically, I think his reason for rejecting that version of the argument comes down to his Platonism. However, he does give a version. So let's call this the Augustine version. It really does depend on Platonism. But Aquinas' version is somewhat different. He says, there's a better and a worse. There's a more and a less. Okay? There are all sorts of things where there are gradations. So, for example, hot and cold is a sort of scale of hot and cold. What are things like this? Well, more accurate, less accurate. There are scales there. There are lots of adjectives that are scalar in this way, where you can talk about comparatives and superlatives, something being better, something being best, and so on. And basically, so the idea is, look, there are a lot of comparative things, comparative features of language, that point to things that have this scalar character. And then he says, but the comparative implies the existence of the superlative. Now, here he doesn't just mean linguistically, that if you've got a linguistic form like better, you can come up with a linguistic form like best. He means if there is such a thing as being better than, then there must be extreme limits here. There must be a best. So it better makes sense. So it's best, and moreover, there must be something that is the best. He actually, unfortunately, gives this illustration with hot and cold. And he says, you know, look, if there is such a thing as warmer or colder, there must be an extreme of heat, which is like light. Okay. From the point of view of modern science, it would be better off with being extreme cold than the absolute zero. But is there such a thing as absolute hot? I mean, he says fire, but contemporary science, no. And it's hard to see why they would have to actually, for one thing, be even a coherent motion with them. What about number? More or less? What about that? You know, what's the top or more scale? There really isn't one. Maybe less gets a zero, but more? It seems like we just keep adding one. And more, why would anything have to exist? So that argument seems very puzzling. And few people have criticized it because few people have taken it seriously. He's obviously wrong somehow. Anyway, I have 15 seconds left, so I will get to the point where how do we get all these properties together? Being the designer, the final cause, being the efficient cause, the first cause, being the perfect being, and so on. I think his answer is also the simplicity of God. And so next time we'll talk about the simplicity of God, and we'll talk about the problem of the Trinity. We'll try to smash those two together, and we'll see what happens.